very much. And just to give some context into your nomination, the judge's comment said that David Clayton was nominated for this award for his tireless work in ensuring all students within Concilium academies have access to an equitable education. As part of this, he's been championed the adoption of GAG pooling within the Trust, which helps drive value of equity across the Trust. Through this hard work, all members of the finance team and wider teams work with the values of equity and integrity at the forefront of everything they do. David is clearly an exceptional role model with a deep understanding of finance underpinned by his background as a chartered accountant. He has a keen eye for detail to ensure maximum resource makes its way to the schools and the classrooms whilst always achieving value for money. The finance team feel empowered to suggest new methods, come up with new ideas that may help to streamline processes and make life easier for school-based staff. I'm sure that was very awkward having that read out while you're listening, but yeah, it's clear that GAG pooling and bringing the organisation to one, and GAG pooling is often a massive part of that, has enabled some pretty good things. So I guess my first question is, GAG pooling, and it needs a rebrand, let's be fair, it's not the best term, GAG pooling. GAG pooling has one term, but the reality is it has very different applications and therefore sometimes gets a bit of a bad rep. Sometimes unfairly, sometimes not. I love that your GAG pooling is in place to drive equity. Could you outline kind of what that means, what your GAG pooling looks like, and perhaps some examples of the inequity that you wanted to remove and GAG pooling was used to do that?
Yeah, so I suppose it goes back to what I just said, really, that when I joined the Trust, there was a need for us to step back and kind of reassess what is the purpose of this organisation, why do we exist, what we're here to do, what are the values that drive us, and what are the things that we think are really important when we talk about an organisation that's responsible for educating more than 6,000 young people. And ultimately, what we're here to do is to ensure that every child, regardless of their background, has the same opportunities to not only succeed, but to thrive in their time both in school and beyond. And I suppose we know that there are inbuilt inequalities within the education system, and any of those that we can address through our work as a trust just seems like the right way forward. So rather than our kind of funding model driving our work, it's our work and our values that drive our funding model. And I think when I initially started working with the Trust, there were so many barriers around the relative size of different schools and therefore the resources that each of them had, which were really kind of determining the kind of education that students in different schools could get. And our view as a Trust was that, you know, we've got some schools that have 1,100 students on roll, we've got some secondary schools that have less than 500 students on roll at this point in time. And that should not determine certainly the breadth of education or the breadth of a curriculum that a student receives. So it's not acceptable that in some of our schools back in 2019, some students didn't benefit from specialist music provision. That's not okay. And just because they go to a smaller school does not mean they don't deserve the same breadth of curriculum as everybody else. So to us, it just seemed like a sensible approach to say we're one organisation, again, collectively responsible for the education of 6,000 pupils. So we use our collective resources to make sure that every individual gets the best experience they can. And I think when you think about it in those simplistic terms and without worrying about perhaps the mechanics of that, just think about it as a principle. I think that's really difficult to argue. I think where the system tends to fall down is that when we get obsessed with the mechanics of that, and I think a lot of that is about perception. It's a loss of autonomy, and I'm not a big fan of the word autonomy because I think that's misrepresented as well. But it's that loss of flexibility from a head teacher's point of view. It's that loss of kind of power, for want of a better phrase. And actually, it doesn't necessarily need to mean any of those things. All it means is us working together collectively to say, how do we need to distribute our resources so that every child in our trust gets a fair shot? And again, I think as a principle, that's really difficult to argue with. When you then agree on the principle, OK, the mechanics then following, that takes some brain power to think about how do we do this in a way that doesn't make people feel disempowered, how we do this in a way that doesn't make the whole kind of finance system operate in a really bureaucratic way, which actually slows down progress. All of that can be worked out once that initial principle is agreed on. But yeah, you asked about the examples of how the GAG pooling model has addressed issues of equity. Well, that music provision is one of them. You know, that to me is a basic fundamental right of every child to learn a full and rich music curriculum. That wasn't happening historically because some of our schools simply couldn't afford it. So it was being delivered by non-specialist teachers because they were doing that as part of a timetable that also incorporated other subjects. That just isn't fair. And so, you know, our GAG pooling model has meant that we can now stand back and say the core curriculum in all our schools gives the same opportunities and the same entitlements for every pupil. We're really proud of that. We're really proud of that because you now go into those schools where that's been a development over the last couple of years, and you see the way the schools come into life as a result. And so that funding model has directly contributed to not just a school improvement agenda under kind of an Ofsted framework or any of that, but it's actually contributing to our mission of genuinely improving life chances of those pupils.
It's music to my ears, David, because I mean I've been talking about GAG pooling in various guises for quite some time, and I could never articulate it the way you just have, because too often I think a big perhaps problem holding back the sector around GAG pooling is the getting held up around the mechanism, and I completely understand why, because of the people involved and the culture and all the things that go with it. But what gets lost is actually what can it enable you to do as an organisation. It allows you to be an organisation, but you need to have that vision to drive the GAG pooling approach or model, or not. If that's not your vision, then GAG pooling is not for you. But GAG pooling is not an accountant's way of making finances easier. It's a way as an organisation to really deliver things that actually would be really challenging if you had to do that within the unit of each school. So, you know, whilst it's difficult to, and you would never argue with the vision of why it's good, you still have to get that through hearts and minds. So how did you go about translating that vision into a pooling of resources? What did you have? Was it a long process? Was it something that you just did very quickly, or how did that look?
I just think it goes back to that conversation is not just about a funding model. It's about a much broader kind of cultural development of how are we as an organisation going to work with our schools. So I think it's about not looking at this in isolation as one thing, because that's when it becomes obsessed with the mechanics. But actually, as an organisation, how do we want to behave? And so at that time, we were going through a whole period of considering what type of organisation we wanted to be. And there wasn't a leader in the trust who didn't think it was great for us to be more collaborative, to work on more closely in partnership. And equally, when we talked about this concept of equity for every student, nobody disagreed with that. And so I think when it then came to talking about the funding model, it was about saying, look, let's rethink, let's remind ourselves about all these core principles that we've discussed and agreed upon, without worrying about the mechanics, because we'll come to that later. As a principle, do we actually think that this is the right way of devolving resources so that every student gets that fair shot? And once everybody sits there and says, well, yeah, like in principle, it has to be, because if we're saying that we genuinely believe in equity, the funding formula as it currently operates and the way that our schools are resourced at the moment does not provide that. So we're failing against our own value if we don't do something differently to resolve that issue. So I think getting people to understand and think about the principle, like I said before, the mechanics was fundamentally our starting point. And so actually we didn't find that difficult. I kind of went into those discussions thinking, really well prepared, thinking these are going to be some tough conversations and heads are going to give me a really tough time about this because they're going to want to. And actually they weren't, because they recognise that as a trust in so many different ways, we needed to behave differently to maximise the value of our trust partnership. And this was just an example of that. And I suppose it comes down to trust with a small t as well, in that we developed trust within those leadership teams that actually we were going to behave true to our values. They believed us when we said that this was about driving equity. It wasn't about creating a big pool of money in the middle for me to play with. That was never the intention. And actually, the way it's worked is, I think quite often when we talk about GAG pooling, we talk about winners and losers. You hear that a lot. If you're in a trust and that implements GAG pooling, will you be a winner or will you be a loser? And I think that in itself as well is also an important mindset to shift, because if as a trust we genuinely believe that collective responsibility, then all our school leaders are also trust leaders, and they also share a collective responsibility for every child across the trust. So that mindset of winners and losers is an important one to eradicate. But actually, in the way that we implemented it at Concilium, there were no losers, because the way in which GAG pooling just unlocked so many potential efficiencies, so many potential opportunities to do things differently, more efficiently, meant that every school kind of won, if you think about it in those terms, but in fairness, by different degrees, depending on, you know, their historical resourcing. So I think, yeah, that mindset shift was a really important one.
I think that's a really important point. I'm looking at one of my questions where I ask about the winners and losers. So I am guilty of fanning the flames on winners and losers, but the way you address that just makes so much sense, because actually if you're all part of a trust that operates better as one, then you can't be a loser in that situation, and that's a really nice way of framing it.
I think it's so important, isn't it, that we do challenge those perceptions of what GAG pooling is and as a model, because I think there are quite rightly some horror stories about it, but in every case it's about the way it's been led and the way it's been implemented, and I would argue the values and the purpose behind it. And if the values and the purpose are true, then there's no reason why the challenges that the mechanics present can't be dealt with so that it's delivered in the right way.